Okay.
So, hi, Simon. Very
Ciarán, hi.
nice to speak to you. People who
Nice
will
to
be
speak
watching
to you
this
too.
video will know who you are, but I'll just say for the sake of it that you're the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in Brooklyn, New York. Are you in Brooklyn at the moment?
Yeah, I am because I was meant to be in Midtown Manhattan, but there's been a huge storm today, really
Okay.
a lot of rain, like 5, 6 inches of rain fell this morning. So
Yeah.
my wife has gone to work and I am at home in my Liverpool gear. So, so I'm here, yeah. And it's very nice to talk to you. And I'm happy to talk about R.D. Laing,
Yeah,
Ronnie.
what prompted this for me, Simon, was my interest is I'm an occupational therapist,
Hmm.
and I'm interested in what role phenomenology can play in occupational therapy.
Yeah.
And I was struck rereading a bit of Ordy Lang's Divided Self recently, how he's trying to use phenomenology in his setting back in the 1960s. But I've worked in a psychiatric setting here, and I can't emphasize enough how little Ordy Lang is regarded among practicing psychiatrists these days. I mean, I wouldn't even dream of mentioning his name in front of them.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a wry amusement towards him, and I think it's borne out by there's a section in this book here, the Oxford Handbook of Psychiatry, where
Oh,
he's just dismissed in about a paragraph, and they say we mention this only for historical reasons. It might be of historical
really?
interest, to know where this anti-psychiatry stuff comes from.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me a little bit about how you became interested in Ordy Lang's work.
Well, it's quite an interesting story actually, because I was a student in the 1980s, did philosophy, and then I quickly became interested in phenomenology. I still think of myself as an existential phenomenologist. So what do? I was like, existential phenomenology. I got aggressive way,
Yeah.
existential phenomenology. And in Britain at that point, um, there was very little interest in phenomenology. There were a couple of places that taught it, one of which where I was, and I got a job at the University of Essex. There'd been some people at Manchester, but that goes back to the 50s and 60s, and they'd founded something called the British Society for Phenomenology. And that I think was founded in the 62.
Mm-hmm.
And they used to have a meeting in Oxford in a one of the crummier colleges, and I went to that. I was probably 28, and so I didn't know anybody there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but who I met were a handful of academics who were more or less engaged in what I thought was important, and a lot of people connected to the Philadelphia Association, which I'd never heard of before. And the Philadelphia Association was the association that Laing and others set up in the 60s to train therapists. And I don't think I'd really I think probably heard the name, but I didn't really know anything about Laing. So I found myself in a situation where there were these people that were Langians, and they were interested in Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, Heidegger, and Levinas in particular Levinas. And I was very
Mm-hmm.
much interested in Levinas. So
Yeah.
and these were people like John Heaton and Steve Gans, and these were people that had really been through 60s counterculture, um, and they'd participated in they were kind of freaks in the best possible way.
Yeah.
And they had and they some of them had been in Kingsley Hall or the other places where there were these experiments with living together with people who were diagnosed as schizophrenic, and um and so I got interested then, and it sort of rumbled on, but quietly, and then for, I mean, much later. He kept popping up, but I was always surprised by how little interest there was in Laing. And I remember talking to the Philadelphia Association a couple of times, and even they'd kind of forgotten about Laing. So then we fast forward to a few years ago, actually about 8 years ago now. My mother died, and for whatever reason, and I couldn't tell you what the reason was, but for whatever reason, in the after she died, I found myself reading The Divided Self by
Okay.
and it made sense of a whole number of things I was thinking about. And since then, I've really been, whenever I see someone, I don't know, that's interested in this bundle of things, and I point them towards The Divided Self and try and, recommend or insist that they read it. And in New York, he has, there's probably a smaller reputation. There's a memory of him as kind of a guru, as a kind of drunk guru.
Yeah.
And and there was a moment when, and clearly he was borrowing a lot from what was happening in American psychiatry and anti-psychiatry at the time, so he's not really favorably seen. And there's interest. And I met, for example, the guy that was involved with this movie Asylum, which I'd recommend to anyone. You can find it on YouTube, I think, called Asylum, and it is footage from inside one of the houses where this experiment was taking place. And one of the people, what's his name, Leon Redler, was someone that I'd met and got to know. So and I've become, I think I've become progressively more anti-Freudian as time has passed. I mean, Freud is a genius and all of that, but I'm a phenomenologist. I think phenomenology is the best way of thinking about everything, and there's a tendency in psychoanalysis to describe behavior in too cold terms, and then to attribute this to various causal agencies, Oedipus complex, castration, and then with Lacanianism that gets even more extreme. As fascinating as Lacan is, but so Laing is, for me, an unsung hero. Then maybe the last bit in the story, there's more to say, would be, David Bowie died. David Bowie died a month after my mother died. There was no connection between those two events.
Yeah.
But it was, for me, it was a weird way of organizing, channeling my grief for my mother through the death of Bowie. And then I was surprised and delighted to hear that Bowie listed his 100 favorite books, and one of them was The Divided Self. And then you sort of think, oh yes, of course, Aladdin Sane, yeah, of course. And in Lang's Divided Self, there is one of the most interesting cases is a young man called David, and I've always thought of that as a kind of test case for Bowie, and so those are the kind of
right
bits and pieces, and I continue to give the book. It's one of those books, very few books that I give to people, I order for people, please read this. It's really good.
Yeah, and kind of similarly, I think of Audie Lang a bit as an ostracized thinker.
Yeah.
There's a lot of those around today, because there's a lot of cranks around today with the internet and the COVID thing and the COVID denial and all the rest of it. But I think of Wilhelm Reich a bit in terms like Teilhard de Chardin, for example. I think I mentioned to you in some of our correspondence, and Wilhelm Reich, I suppose, as well. Kind of 60s cultural figures who I feel like you're not supposed to read, really, because they're uncitable in some sense in an academic text for me, working within healthcare,
Yeah.
kind of slightly potty people who were associated with that time. But I'm delighted that I was introduced to those writers by people who were eccentric enough to continue to read them. And what Artie Lang writes about, there's a lot in The Divided Self, which I suppose is very dated. He's writing in 1960, so homosexuality, for example, is still considered a mental illness, and that
Yeah.
comes through here and there. And there's some outmoded terminology, but a lot of what it says for me is very prescient for what's happening now in the neuroaffirmative movement. I don't know if you know much about that. It relates to autistic people and really autistic research being done by actually autistic people. There's a lot in what Lang says that kind of foreshadows what's going on there. For example, his insistence on avoiding person first language. There's a point in it where he says that, let's see if I can quote this. Yeah, he says, no one has schizophrenia like having a cold. The patient has not got schizophrenia. He is schizophrenic.
Yeah.
That's the way people want to talk now about autism. They want to stop this language of such and such has autism and prefer to say things like such and such person is autistic. And kind of what my concern here is to be able to argue that sort of case, which is a phenomenological point, I suppose, without being accused of being on the side of somebody who the people who are more inspired by the medical model would consider to be a quack. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But how to salvage what's good in Artie Lang now and to reinvigorate him.
Yeah, I think it's very very prescient for all sorts of things that are going on now, and in particular, I think the kind of, I mean, what Lang calls the false self system.
Yeah.
So this, what human beings do in fantasy with a PH is that they'll live in a false self system, and the schizophrenic is the schizophrenic, in quotation marks, is the extreme case of that. But the rest of us are just somewhere along that spectrum, and this is the the delusions that we live with, the way in which the image of the self is kind of fractured, punctuated in our relationship to things like social media, and then the way in which that's led to what people call the mental health crisis, and so on and so forth. So I think Lang is incredibly important, and has been all too easily kind of forgotten. A victim of his fame, I think. I think that Lang gets very famous, celebrated very young. There's the story of the Rolling Stones when Brian Jones was going through some stuff, and they were trying to get Ronnie Lang to see him. It was referred to as Ronnie by the people at the Philadelphia Association, which I always liked.
Yeah,
and so he was a celebrity, and then a celebrity over here in the United States, and that that's a strange ride, and it must have been difficult. His personal life is complicated. One of the books that I've got, which is, I don't know if you read this, is the Artie Lang by his son.
I haven't read that one, no.
Adrian Lang, which is be your worst nightmare to have a book like this written by a child. It's very fair, but he's clearly pretty pissed off with the way he was treated by his father, and there's a lot of anger in there. But it's fascinating, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's Lang pops up in sometimes in corners of the art world. There was I think a Scottish artist filmmaker called Luke Fowler that did some stuff with Lang about 15 years ago, and then of course there was that movie with Mad to Be Normal with
Yeah, David
David
Tennant.
Tennant,
Yeah,
which
no.
wasn't terrible. It wasn't bad, and
Hmm.
I taught Laing as part of. I had this class in 2019. So it was no. It was 2020. It was during the pandemic. Yeah,
Hmm.
so it's very much pandemic related. And I called it the abdication of ecstasy, which
Okay.
always sounded like a kind of a sort of 90s shoegazing band or something
The
like that.
prog rock album, yeah.
Right, yeah, the abdication of ecstasy. And so I like that. So and I got some. That was one of the few classes that during the pandemic went incredibly well, and I had Laing at the center of that, and it as Laing would say, it turned some people on.
Right.
It turned
Yeah.
some people on to Laing, and they've stayed with it. And I was doing that really as Laing, some stuff on literature, Beckett, bits and pieces, and then we went into a series of mystical texts, in particular
Mm.
Christian mysticism, and then that's now become something else, a book on mysticism, and the Laing material has dropped out. But I've got all of this really detailed notes on Laing, which at some point I'm going to try and do something with that. But so I was very grateful for for you getting in touch, because it's got me thinking about Laing again, and I want to do that. I don't know what I want to do with it, but I know I want to think more about Laing, and it's I guess the key term for me, or a key term for me in the last 10 years has really become experience, which is kind of
Mm.
the other thing I've got here, which is this is a American first edition of The Politics of Experience,
Okay.
which
Yeah.
was kind of his big book in the US.
Hmm.
Pantheon, who are a great press, and these are essays written in his in his prime, and clearly did really well. But the centrality of experience, and in a sense, all he wants is experience, but the problem that he faces, which is what the divided self diagnoses. So for me, the divided self is I could summarize my interest in the following way. On the one hand, clearly, as Laing says, this is a book which is an attempt to make the process of going mad or being mad comprehensible, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a phenomenology of madness.
Yeah.
But and that's fascinating, and that really happens in the last chapters of the book. But in the early chapters of the book, which for me is the kind of the much more interesting part, he has this idea of what he calls the sane schizoid.
Yes. Yeah.
The sane schizoid individual. And the sane schizoid individual is someone who doesn't really experience what they experience, that they, in a sense, are internally dead.
Mm.
Internally dead, in a sense, this is so schizophrenia, in the way Laing describes it, and there's other evidence for that. One kind of way that is described is the feeling of being dead, of being a corpse, of rotting away. Can't you smell my corpse rotting?
Yes.
And that deadness, I think, is something that you know we all share, or we all share. The other main category that Laing introduces, which for me is really, really important, really powerful, is ontological insecurity.
Yeah.
So there are people who are ontologically secure. And I've got a passage here, which I found. This is from Self and Others from 1961, which is kind of
Okay.
a into
Yeah.
the divided self, written with David Cooper.
Hmm.
And it's really good description of ontological security. Ontological security is that I have a body with an inside and an outside, that life begins at birth and ends at death, that I occupy a certain position in space, and my existence is a continuity from one place and one moment to the next. That's what the ontologically secure person feels. The schizoid, which certainly includes me, and I think includes most people, believes none of this. He does not take his own person as embodied, alive, real, substantial, and continuous. He lacks the usual sense of personal unity, of being the agent of his actions. He sees himself, or she sees himself, or they see themselves as a robot, a thing, something dead, that someone else is using his eyes and ears. So this sense of internal deadness, so all that Laing wants to do is to recover the richness of experience. The problem is that we don't experience experience. Experience is, for us, shriveled, desiccated, and that's what it means to be a normal schizoid self. And it's that really, and that ontological insecurity, that's what really gets me in Laing. So we have to life is a struggle to regain something like experience, having lost it. And then if you add to that the fact that everything else in the world is kind of conspiring to rob us of experience, in particular our relationship to technology, then the task which Laing set himself is even harder at this point. And what's happened in psychiatry, in psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis has sort of gone in the opposite direction, it seems to me. And the tendency towards medicalization, the invention of new diagnostic categories through which people are filtered and controlled, and Laing wanted something else. And all that Laing did, yesterday I was looking at interviews with him and thinking back to what people said about me and what people said about him. And the thing that I remember people saying about Laing, apart from the complaints about drinking or whatever it might be, was his extraordinary empathy. He was someone who was able to connect with people, people who were sick in a human and direct way, and he didn't know. His problem, he says this in Divide Yourself and elsewhere, was that he thought he was stupid as a young doctor because he couldn't tell who was mad and who wasn't mad. And he couldn't diagnose them, but he very much liked sitting with them and establishing a connection and talking or not talking, just being. And then the idea that I guess and you must have seen this too, is if you have someone who is I don't know, floridly psychotic, who's really just say floridly psychotic, experiencing whatever they're experiencing and shouting, screaming. One way of dealing with that is just to sit and talk, and then eventually things will settle down, and you begin to. And then if you can inject, humor into the situation, and then that, because schizophrenics don't laugh much. The laughter is requires that kind of self-deprecating. Anyway, so I think Laing is hugely important and unjustly forgotten, certainly by the medical establishment, and so we need to do everything we can to bring him back.
And that's exactly why I'm interested in phenomenology, because one of the things it involves is empathy, right, and person-centeredness,
Yeah.
I mean, I do have an example I can talk to you about when I was dealing with a floridly psychotic patient. It was the first time I'd ever met him. My hair was a bit shorter than it is now, and I was having glasses on, and I had to interact with this guy through a very small window. I wasn't able to get through the door because it was locked, and he was a danger to himself and potentially to me. And there was a little curtain dividing us as well. So my role was to knock on the door and check in with him and introduce myself as his occupational therapist. So I knocked the door and I pulled back the curtain. And what he said to me was, "What are you? Some kind of Harry Potter bastard? Fuck off." And I thought, we're at the beginning of rapport here, because he's clearly thinking in some sort of a way, how can I piss off this guy, the next nuisance who's come to me today? And there's a
Yeah.
sort of a recognition, an attempt at engagement, even if it's hostile, a humor. And I thought, we're off to a good start here. Does that make sense? And it's just about being with the person where they're at the time. And I think if you think phenomenologically for long enough, and if you steep yourself in it, I guess as I did, it somehow kind of comes out in your work.
Yeah. I mean, it's about, treating persons as persons. I mean, that's really, that's the core of Lang's approach, is that you're not seeing behavior, you're not seeing symptoms, you're not seeing things that you can fit into diagnostic categories. You are face to face with a person. And one of the things that he picks up is the I-thou relationship from Martin Buber, that we are in I-thou relationships, or I-you relationships, whereas we overwhelmingly see human beings in terms of I-it relationships. I mean, people with diagnosed as its, as organisms who are exhibiting behaviors. So I think it's a question of not seeing behavior but trying to see experience, and seeing experience is very difficult because it's not there. So what you're seeing is behavior, what you have to see is experience, and you can only get there with by what I think what Laing and Cooper call in one place inter-experience. You spend time, and that inter-experience is, has to begin with the thought that this is a person, you're a person, they're a person, you're two persons, and you can enter into, you can make a connection on that basis. And that's basically the core of it. And then describe what's happening in terms which are comprehensible to that person and comprehensible to yourself, not just comprehensible to, I don't know, the medical establishment or whatever. And I mean, that's the core of it. It seems to be. It's to that extent, it's really stupid and obvious, treating persons as persons, except we just don't. We treat persons as whatever, as bits of machinery, as people that are fulfilling certain roles, as monsters, or as whatever it might be. And so Laing is trying to get us back to that personalistic approach, and that is something which happens in phenomenology in the 1920s, and really within the work of Husserl and Heidegger, and then kicks off a lot along its way. And Laing kind of makes that accessible and intelligible. And a
really nice, well-meaning talk I was at when I worked for the NHS in England was an hour-long talk delivered by one of the consultants, and it was called "Seeing the Person in the Patient." And I sat through it thinking, gone through university, like a lot of people here have, sort of learning to do the opposite, sort of learning to see people as exhibiting, as you say, symptoms, or seeing them through the prism of biomechanics, or physiology and things like that. And to then have an hour thrown in this far down the line to go, oh, hang on a second, there's a person there, that you're meeting. It did seem a little bit too little too late. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well, because I'd listened to your podcast Heidegger, where you were talking about Heidegger, of course. And something that Laing says in The Divided Self at a certain point was on the nothing. I think he's quoting Sartre at this point, and he says, he's speaking from the perspective of the schizoid person, and he says, even worse perhaps than the possible presence of bad things in the dark is the terror that in the dark is nothing and no one. And I really love Lang's kind of language there. It's quite poetic, isn't it? Have you anything to say about Laing and Sartre and the nothing, or das Nicht, I think?
Well, nothing is more real than nothing. I think that's Beckett from the trilogy. It's that sense in which the most what does he say, Laing? He's never met a schizophrenic person, and we're using that term loosely. Never met a schizophrenic person that experienced love. It's a life which is lived in fear. And
he says that they live in a frightening world in which dread is unmitigated by love. In the quote.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where they are, and that's also where we are too, in the sense that the person diagnosed as a schizophrenic is one step ahead of how we very often feel about things. So it's a question of the letting that nothing, which is obviously a ridiculous thing to say, but that's what the way Heidegger puts it. But the point of that is that how would I put this? The real connection for me between say people like Heidegger and what's happening in phenomenology and Laing turns around the question of anxiety. So for Heidegger, the late 20s is where anxiety reveals the nothing, and then people have a field day taking pot shots at that. And it seems to me that Laing intuits that, and more than that, it's for me anyway. And this is, I think this says maybe a lot about the people who are attracted to Laing and who Laing was. Someone with a very complicated relationship with his mother. His mother as a kind of refrigerator mother, as used to be said at a certain point. This was his domestic environment in Glasgow was characterized by a complete absence of love, and also a complete absence of friends or anything like that. And I think he talks about the shadow of the mother falling across the schizoid position, and that is something that I think is true of Laing. It's certainly, I think it's true of people like me and a lot of other people. And there's that's something to think about. But for me, the anxiety issue is really, just incredibly powerful. That in The Divided Self, he describes, let's see if I can get this right, three mechanisms of anxiety, if you like, or three mechanisms that lead to this schizoid position, make us insecure. Engulfment, implosion, and petrification. And for me, these were absolutely revelatory when I first read them, and then when I went back to it much later, absolutely revelatory. That the sense of being, the sense of the external world as being, and others as being engulfing, potentially engulfing, you being swallowed by the others around whom you have to exist. And the sense of implosion that produces. So the fear of engulfment leads the self to implode into itself, into an isolation, into an emptiness, which is that quote about the nothing and no one, and the third one is petrification, things being turned to stone. And and so things are turned persons because they threaten to engulf, and I implode and isolate myself to deal with that. I turn them into things, into stone. And that sense, so he says in a couple of places in the Divided Self about the schizoid and the schizophrenic as having a Medusa's head that turns things. And that's absolutely right and incredibly powerful. I think, if there were three concepts to take from Laing, which I would just want everybody to think about, it would be engulfment, implosion, and petrification. That the world, I think this is something which the pandemic brought into focus in a way that we still really haven't thought through. That sense of others as engulfing, as sources of possible disease, sickness and death. That implosion into ourselves, which led to all sorts of acting out. And then petrification, that we turn people into stones, into things, into representatives of impersonal forces. Whether that's Donald Trump or whoever it might be, and then what goes along with that is that we turn ourselves, we petrify ourselves, for Laing. The schizoid position is one where I'm also dead. I'm dealing with an internal deadness. So I turn that Medusa's head onto myself. And then the question becomes, well, how can I actually feel anything, really feel anything? And I think that's a question that Laing sort of leaves us with. And I think there's nothing. I think that's exactly where we are with the world at the present time. So I think Laing is frighteningly relevant.
Yeah, and I think there's parallels there with what you're saying about the autistic experience of sometimes the terminology that they'll use is meltdown or shutdown, because the world is just too overwhelming. At a sensory level, people with sensory differences struggle to cope in a kind of neurotypical world, which has expectations and demands to be made of them. And a lot of the work that we would do with autistic people is really about accommodations and a kind of psychoeducation that the world is not. It's not made with people who aren't neurotypical in mind, really. So it's very much a kind of social model approach that we use these days, for being neuroaffirmative. But one of the things that you said, and it really struck me in your Heidegger podcast, was, and I've used this in sessions actually, is you're interpreting Heidegger as saying, in a sense, that anxiety is the ready, steady go of how to live. Really, it kind of prepares you, it sets you up for going, oh, something's up, and maybe I can do something about it if you have the kind of will to do that. Is there a way in which you can kind of take that and use it? And then to follow up with a related question, I suppose, I often kind of wonder to what extent we can use philosophy as self-help. How do you feel about the idea that a philosophy book could be or not be a self-help book? Do you think it's a helpful way to think about it, or is it unhelpful? What's your thought on that?
I think we need, there's I think philosophy is self-help in the sense in which it helps lots of selves. I think that's what people, can find when they read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, or Plato's Phaedo, or whatever it might be. So yeah, but I think the what's happened in the last 15, 20 years is I read something about this the other day, a condescension that academics have now realized that doing things in public might further their own careers, and so they will condescend to speak to ordinary people through whatever means they can. And there's a kind of, I think, stupid self-help condescension which irritates the hell out of me, and in particular at the present moment it finds articulation around Stoicism.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's the most
everywhere
distasteful school of, not so much the early Stoics, they were okay, a form of Stoicism that takes flight in Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, Seneca's a great dramatist, terrible philosopher in my view. And it's a kind of philosophy which gives you a kind of a nice warm fuzzy feeling, and there's some divinity out there, but kind of vague, and it doesn't really make any pressures on the world. I'd much rather talk to an Orthodox Christian than a Stoic or a Neo-Stoic. So there's a lot of that around. So I think what one thing you can learn from Laing, and what I've read of Laing and seen of Laing, and is that he didn't condescend. He was in what we would now call a public intellectual. He was a public figure, and there are those films or snippets of films of him on stages in the US in sort of flared velvet pants and looking very much the guru, but he didn't condescend. He was able to connect to people as people in a very serious way, and not to do things that were intelligible, understandable, but didn't talk down. I think there's a huge tendency. We say self-help tendency in philosophy to talk down to people. They're a little bit stupid, and philosophers can help them. Of course, they're not really doing real philosophy. This is kind of we're soiling it. So I don't like that. Yeah, and I think so I think it's a question of of not condescending, and I think philosophy. I begin from the arguable premise in my approach to life that people are not stupid. That's kind of where I begin from.
Yeah.
They're not dumb, and they're probably decent on the whole, and not stupid. So if you're trying to address people or find an audience, don't condescend to people, and don't treat them as idiots, and don't think they're malevolent. I think it's another thing about Laing is that his ability to connect with people, which is obviously the key to his therapeutic practice, but also his he kind of leveled with people, and he was as raw and unfinished as the patients he was diagnosing. He was a messy individual, R.D. Laing, right? Is what's so attractive about him. Flaws are kind of evident, and he's also it's not that it's just autobiographical, but a lot of it is. I think the stuff in Knots is very clearly about his relationship to his mother and the absence of love and so on and so forth. So I think I think you can see that, or you can feel that kind of rawness and honesty in what Laing is doing, and that kind of shines through in a way in which you don't find that in Heidegger. He's far too arrogant and full of himself. Just saying it's pouring with the most extraordinary rain at the moment. This is
wow.
Yeah, it's wild.
We had a wild storm here the other day, but now it's sunny with showers. I think it's probably a good place to end the talk of Orty Lang for the moment.
Okay.
Thanks a million for that.
Oh,
and I'll stay on the line.
Yes, I'll stay on the line.
I'll end this. Thanks for watching.